I'll just hit continue here. So I'm an assistant professor. I'm new to UVic, joined about a year and a half ago. I'm at the School of Public Administration and really pleased to be presenting some research findings today on this work on just transitions, together with Megan Gordon, who is a master's student at the University of Northern British Columbia. And it's been really fun working with her on this because she was involved in Canada's Coal Transitions Secretariat at the Federal Task Force. So Megan, why don't you give a wave? So I'll start the presentation and then she'll chime in a moment. And I'd be really interested, we're gonna try and do a quick presentation, share our high level findings, and we'd love to talk to you. I imagine some of your work connects with this or you're drawing on this concept. I'd be curious how it connects and the utility of what we've done here. And I'll explain what that is in a moment. And I'm really pleased to be joining ICEVIC. It's a really engaged community, I can just tell already, and very happy to be part of the team. So today we're just going to outline the problem quickly, unpack what's behind this concept, and then get to the meat of it, which is, well, what are just transition policies? And this is something that we've identified as sort of lacking in the literature, that there is this concept that has gained a lot of traction, but we don't necessarily understand what this looks like in implementation, which is starting to ramp up. And then to draw out some lessons from this comparative policy learning. And in terms of the problem, I mean, you all work on this, you know it well. We need to transition to sustainable production and a post-carbon economy. And, you know, 40% of our GHG emissions are in the industrial sector in Canada, and it's a big part of our GDP. Not so much direct employment, around 2%, but indirect, much higher. And so industrial transitions are central to meeting our climate commitments of the future. And this has been slow, of course, in the face of entrenched industries, infrastructure, and interests. And of course, when you look at certain industries, such as the Alberta oil sands, these are regionally concentrated economies and societies. And so those are the political interests that are challenging here. And I love this, I just wanted to quickly show, this is from the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity, and I just love how they give this snapshot of our economy. So these are Canadian exports in 1995. And what do you see? You see that we had a large automotive manufacturing sector, balanced by quite a large agricultural sector, and then a much smaller minerals, oil, and coal crude sector. And then if you skip forward to closer to now, don't you just automatically see this switch and how important this is to our economy? That brown box kind of on the left there, that's our petroleum, oils, and crudes, and it's huge. And it has supplanted manufacturing. So this is a very big shift in our economy over time. So the concept of a just transition, it really emerged in the American labor movement in the 1970s. And it's not necessarily related to environmental regulation, although that was part of it, but more broadly about how we deal fairly with industries that are transitioning. And it has since gained momentum in Canada. In particular, the use of the concept really grew in 1995, in the mid-90s, in BC among the unions dealing with forestry transitions, the forestry sector. And it's now a globally prominent term, and we're seeing a lot of uptake in this concept. And it's grown in importance with relation to all these measures around climate action. And if you look at the concept, the key thing here is these elements of justice. On the first hand, there is, how do we identify the rights holders involved in this transition? That's recognitional justice. The second one is, how do we manage this process? Who is included? How are the voices included and so on? Is it co-management? How do we resolve conflict? And that's procedural justice. And the final one is, how do we distribute costs and benefits? So those are the three elements of justice. And amongst those three elements of justice, what you see in the literature is a different conception of what this justice means. You have, on the one hand, a job-centric view, which has been typically from the union movement, saying that policies should focus on workers and communities impacted. An environment-centric view, which really says we need to think broader and just focus on the shift to a zero carbon economy and what comes along with that. And then there's another suite of literature that is what we would say is more society-centric, and it's things like the Green New Deal. It's a just transition to uplift and support workers, communities, and societies at large. And it's interesting because among the suite of policies that you see, they do connect to these distinct, there's overlap, but these distinct sort of frames. So that comes to, well, what are just transition policies? We see this is an important concept. It's embedded in different ideas of justice. It has different approaches, but what do the policies actually look like on the ground? So the literature on just transitions has tended to focus on specific communities. It's involved a lot of case studies, and there hasn't been a sort of a big picture view about what implementation looks like. That's what we tried to do in this study. So we wanted to look for just transition policies in the places and regions that you'd think would have them. In order to do that, we looked across advanced economies, OECD countries, of which there are 36, and we identified regions, sub-regions, so something below a region, so below a province or a territory in Canada, for which the economy had 25% share or higher of employment in industry, that includes energy, for which over the last 20 years, that share of employment has declined. So you're looking at sub-regional economies that had a lot of industrial employment, that employment transitioned, and then we say, okay, so what happened? And if you look at we used the OECD regional database to do this work, and what we found is that amongst all OECD countries, of which there are 36, we found 26 countries, and within those countries, 74 regions that had these characteristics. Based on that, we then did a big policy review to say, what were the policies in these places? And what that looks like is that kind of methodology. I determined those regions that have transitioned, again, that's a 20-year time frame, and then other high industry regions for which the share of industry remains quite high, ones where it's growing share of industrial employment, and one where it's a lower industry region where the share of employment is not that important. For Canada, the US, Mexico, all these OECD countries, this is across Europe. You can kind of see a lot of the transitioned regions are in, around Eastern Europe, and the Baltics and so on. And then here we have Chile, Korea, Japan, and Australia. And that gives you an idea of our cases. So we're looking for, breadth. So based on that, what did we find? Now, this is the thing. I can't share our data with you because it's these big tables with all these different policy criteria under them, and then all of these different countries and regions across. So these very large data tables that say, well, this is what they're doing and this is the approach. And then all of that we've tried to compile in this picture of how is this concept being implemented across all of these countries and places across different scales. So this is the big picture story. This is what I'm going to focus on today, which is we see 6 main policy areas plus the 7th, which is this mechanism of governance, which is absolutely critical for coordinated actions. Among the just transition strategies, policies, and so on that we find, for governance, you tend to see that there are forms of multi-level governance coordination. There are things like collaborative tables in different governments and different polities where they bring together federal, regional, local, union, and private sector actors. There are things like coordination offices or hubs that are in communities being affected by transition that involve multi-level coordination. And then there are consultations and public engagement and so on. That speaks to sort of those deliberative aspects of equity and justice. Then we have this whole range of policies that are called, and I'm just calling them here, climate solutions, but there's a lot of them. They're all of our GHG commitments and everything that entails. They're all of our strategies. They're all of our mitigation adaptation programs. And then they're all of those investments in clean tech and energy transition funds and so on and what they're trying to achieve. And you could say this is like the exogenous push because it's shaping economies, it's shaping industries, it's asking them to react to change. The typical just transitions policies, the ones that we've seen in the past and that remain today, the most common ones are workforce development. And among those, we see employment and skill strategies, training and education programs, a lot of jobs databases and labor market information, and that's trying to ensure that workers who are displaced end up finding jobs, and we hope that those jobs are in green sectors. Then we see a variety of economic development initiatives and strategies, industrial transition commitments, a lot of business and tax incentives, then sector-specific incentives and SME and entrepreneurship support that's trying to shift to a kind of a 4.0 economy and to help transitioning regions find new economic opportunities. Another critical tool across all the countries studied, especially in the European Union of late, is regional development policies, including regional development programs, rural development programs, all of the infrastructure investments we've kind of counted in this area, and the ways those are structured, community resources and investments, and importantly, spatial planning and land management, which we'll talk about, which are often quite absent. Another overarching mechanism is the role of our social security systems in managing these shifts. And those look like things like temporary financial support for displaced workers. It's the uses of our social insurance and unemployment support programs, which can be targeted. And another approach, but you don't see it too often, but it's still there in some countries, is the use of pensions and early retirement incentives in certain industries. For instance, they have this in the United States. And then this final area, which we've called Industry 4.0, includes a lot of policies that are for digitalization, funding for research and higher education, that are promoting an innovation shift. And this often is framed as the solution to our transition, envisioning the economy of the future. So that's kind of the big picture view. And there's a ton of data tables that kind of feed into this understanding. And I'd really welcome your reflections on what you make of this and what you think of it. So that's a big overview, but what does this actually look like in practice? So I'm going to highlight a few examples, and then Megan's going to talk about what this looks like in a few key regions. So some of the high profile examples are, of course, a lot of the coal transitions are excellent examples of a targeted industry specific just transition mechanism. And in Canada, we had the just transition for Canadian coal power workers and communities, which was really a set of recommendations among experts on how to manage this transition that took place in Ontario, and it was federally led. And then out of that, they created transition centers, but it was quite top down. And I know that the Government of Canada is presently looking at revising the Environmental Protection Act to have a just transitions component. I'm not sure what will be in that. They have something called the Just Transitions Act, which is being developed, but this has often been regarded in the literature on just transitions as a great example, and Megan worked for it, she knows it very well, but it was a bit top down actually, and it didn't really involve community supports quite broadly. Another interesting example that might be a leading case is that Spain has these just transition agreements between the national government and the territories that are experiencing coal mine, coal power plant, and nuclear power plant closures. These are very comprehensive agreements. They involve the private sector and the unions and local communities, and they're a highly negotiated and comprehensive agreement about how they're going to manage that process, which is quite unique. Another one we want to highlight, and Megan will talk about this more, is that New Zealand has this Just Transition Unit, which is housed in the Ministry of Business, Innovation, and Employment. And it's this kind of proactive approach. It's trying to identify where these transitions are going to happen next in their economy, for instance, with the phasing out of offshore oil and gas in certain regions, and then how they're going to comprehensively manage that process. So that speaks to how do you organize this within bureaucracies. Another one that is important to note is this just transition mechanism of the European Commission for the coming programming period, so 2020 to 2027. This is totally new. It's going to mobilize 150 billion euros, in part through matching funds, to do three things. It is going to draw on these matching funds for the regional development funds and for the social fund that the European Commission has. Like, this is huge. It's reorienting all these states to focus on these issues. The second thing it's going to do is develop an investment scheme that provides financing according to just transition objectives. And the third thing it's going to do is have a new loan facility leveraged by the European Investment Bank. And there's a whole architecture that comes along with this new just transition mechanism, which includes every EU country is now going to have a national strategy that outlines quite concretely how it's going to manage these transitions. They also are going to be developing spatial strategies that align with that strategy. So there's all these sectoral components, and it's a huge initiative. So much money. This is really going to shift focus. It'll be very interesting to see how these initiatives are then interpreted on the ground by states and by regions. So that was some of the key policy areas we see, but over to Megan now, and she'll tell you about what this looks like in certain regions.
Great, thanks, Tamara. So maybe just to start off, one thing that became apparent through this work is that there are many policy instruments that can help forward industrial transition and just outcomes that are not necessarily branded as just transition mechanisms, as you've seen in the previous examples. To get a better picture of how governments were approaching industrial transitions, we profiled a number of these regions where we could really easily identify the sector that was in transition, such as coal or forestry. And we looked at some of the ways that governments were responding, particularly what direction transition was heading and potential economic solutions. We were looking at whether or not policies were integrated across different areas, as well as between levels of government. And as well, we were looking at whether or not there were specific targeted policy measures in place to support industrial transition or the specific sector in transition. And then, of course, as I'll be speaking to, there is a few unique approaches that we saw in some of these examples that we'll highlight. So I'll ask Tamara to switch the slide. I'll start off with the Grand-Est example. So there were some interesting learnings through this case. Grand-Est is a predominantly rural and agricultural area in northeastern France. And in this case, we saw really strong environmental policies set at the national level, including the Energy Transition Law for green growth. And so these kinds of ambitious climate targets and climate action commitments really set the tone for regional and economic development, and that had a trickle-down effect. So thus, we saw an emphasis for transition in Grand-Est's forest and agricultural sectors to really leverage the economic potential of the low-carbon economy. And of course, one of the focus areas for transition was the bioeconomy. And there were both priorities set at the national and regional level to facilitate the growth of the bioeconomy, which we saw a lot of coherence between those two levels. And of course, this can be used for renewable energy production, which creates that simultaneous economic and environmental benefit. It's also a great example of a region that's capitalizing on new forms of development and creating a bridge between traditional and modern industry, as there's that inherent connection between those two, as the bioeconomy relies heavily on byproducts from forestry and agriculture and other primary sectors. Moving on to the second example. So Saarland, Germany has a traditional coal economy, and it's really been a region in transition for several decades. So we see here again, the national government has been predominantly leading the transition, most recently because of its commitment to phase out coal. And one unique thing about this region is that the growth of the automotive industry is creating somewhat of a revival in steel manufacturing, which allows the region to somewhat maintain its industrial roots. The automotive industry is one of the ways that the government is transitioning away from coal and providing new employment opportunities. But of course, that begs the question as to how this particular region will be able to stay on top of environmental protections and regulations. Another thing, the national government, really this is the kind of key point I want to highlight here, the national government provided targeted supports to states affected by the coal transition as part of their climate action program, which is something that we have determined as being a best practice. There's also a multi-jurisdictional task force to improve regional economic structures of coal regions. So again, those targeted supports rather than a more generic approach to economic development is critical. Here in Saarland, we also see that the national government has a social market economy strategy, which addresses matters related to transition, and it really emphasizes the importance of social security measures to be a part of that transition solution. So for example, given that this is related to the energy sector, one of the things we want to ensure is that the additional costs of the energy transition are not borne by energy consumers and businesses. I'll move on to the third example. So the Bay of Plenty region in New Zealand is a traditional forestry and manufacturing region. Their regional council is looking to shift the economic emphasis towards tourism, renewable energy, and diversification more generally. So unlike the previous two examples, this is really moving away from its industrial tradition. It's noteworthy in this example that the national government implemented a proactive employment strategy, which complements the government's economic vision by ensuring that labor market development is aligned with their vision for transition. And as Dr. Krawchenko mentioned earlier, New Zealand is one of the only regions where there's a governance mechanism in place that guides the country's economic transition approach, which is this Just Transition Unit, which is internal to government. And they've also set up a transition hub, which exists specifically for the purpose of providing advice to government on how to transition to a low carbon economy. I'll also mention here the Bay of Plenty region was unique in the sense that they had very close working relationships with local Indigenous peoples who are very closely involved in decisions regarding the resource sector development. And of course, that connects back to those notions of justice that we were discussing earlier. And one thing we heard over and over again in the literature was there's this increased need to be more inclusive around matters of economic development and transition. And I'll hand it back to Tamara.
Thanks, Megan. So all of this leads us to think, we looked at all these different initiatives and all these policies and strategies across all these different regions. Well, what does this actually tell us? What have we found? So I'm going to bring it back to this infographic that we've developed and just tell you what our reflections are on some of these mechanisms. So when it comes to governance, I think that what we have found across these countries and regions is that those coordination mechanisms are largely absent. When they do exist, they tend to be reactive and ad hoc. And that's not necessarily bad. I mean, if you think, for instance, even how in BC, how the government works to react to declines in employment in the forestry sector. Well, they mobilize internally, they develop ad hoc working committees and groups, and they get the job done. However, if we're looking at broad transitions, really large ones, that's probably not good enough, and it's not proactive. And so that's kind of a lesson from some of this comparative practice. A second one is in terms of the climate policies and the climate solutions. Well, across a large number of the strategies and policies we reviewed, equity considerations are largely absent. One exception is that we're increasingly seeing funds to mitigate energy consumption costs of low-income households. That's increasingly common, but otherwise there's work to do. In terms of workforce development, which is the traditional area of just transitions implementation in terms of policy, is that they are the most common strategies. They do target workers, not communities. They're not often combined with other initiatives. So a big lesson for us is to think, well, what would it look like if we were to have more coordinated and comprehensive policies to manage a transition in a just manner? In terms of economic development, we see a lot of steering and not rowing, which you would expect in our present paradigm. We might need to be much more interventionist in the future and even have public sector ownership in some cases. And this is an ongoing discussion in certain academic disciplines. And there's also the issue of stranded assets, big capital intensive assets that are stranded, which tends not to be addressed here. The regional development policies are very often branded as just transitions policies, but it's questionable to what extent they really address justice and equity. To some extent, I wonder, is this just kind of a new green industrial policy? And the EU will be a big test case here because they are just really, really focusing on this right now. The community level in terms of regional development tends to be, again, quite absent. And this also leads you to think, well, what is the potential of a community to for endogenous development, to rethink, what its economy is going to look like. And that's a challenging one. The social security system is underused. It's going to be critical. Need to think more about our pension systems, which is only a handful of states have used these to facilitate transitions at the present. And then finally, this Industry 4.0, which is often painted as a solution, as the kind of economy of the future, they tend to be branded as just transition policies, but these links to, again, equity and social justice tend to be quite weak. So that's kind of a big picture in a snapshot, the main reflections. And then some of the key issues this raises is, how is justice really being addressed? What's the right scale to manage some of these processes, top down, bottom up? A lot of that depends on the cultures in different countries. I mean, France tends to pursue top down and it tends to work for them sometimes. How are initiatives coordinated? If you take this comprehensive multi-scalar integrated approach, what does that actually look like within a bureaucracy? How do you manage that big picture view? How do you be proactive? And what about the concerns of different communities and their priorities, and particularly in low density places, in rural areas that have much less capacity? Because one of the big issues that we're facing, one of the great challenges, and one of the challenges that European cohesion policy tries to address, is that the inequalities among countries are now less than they are among regions in advanced economies. So we are seeing left behind places. And these transitions, these industrial transitions, have the potential to further cement those inequalities. How are just transition policies going to address that? So those are some of our key reflections. And again, I thank you for your attention. I look forward, we have lots of time to chat now if you can stick around. And this is something that we're kind of peer reviewing now, and we really welcome your thoughts and your feedback.